Welcome to the Appendix N chat. This time we're talking about a fairly minor entry in Gary Gygax's Appendix N from the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons and Dragons, which outlines the literary influences on Dungeons and Dragons. The Amtor series, the Venus series by Edgar Rich Burroughs, which I actually have another one elsewhere, but here you've got Pirates of Venus, Lost on Venus. There's Carson, Napier of Venus. I forget the fourth one's name, and then there's a novella as well. Published between the 30s and 40s, and they are planetary romance like the Barsoom John Carter books, which people are much more familiar with. And I have done a video in the Appendix N chat. I think it was perhaps the first one. These ones are decidedly minor in terms of direct influences. There are more obvious, for instance, White Apes. He gets from Gary Gygax, gets from Barsoom, and you get a few other examples like that where you can, well, in some books, many, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, for instance, where you just point and say these 10 things were directly taken over. In other cases, you can say, okay, well, this class is heavily influenced by this, even if it's not a one-to-one. You see that a lot, for instance, with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Magic heavily comes from Jack Vance's Dying Earth. Here, I did my research. I went through what other people have said about the Appendix N influences from these books. I've looked at a few sources, and I was like, oh, I'm really struggling. But as I reflected, there are a couple of things which I think could come to mind as coming from here amongst other places, if nothing else. One, these are good examples of, if you want dungeon traps, these have, more or less every major section of these books has a dungeon trap in some format, some sort of like, I've got to disarm this thing, or I've got to find a secret door, or I've got to pick one of 7 corridors. That happens once, and the other 6 have death in them, things like that. That's fairly common in these books, and given that Burroughs first writes Barsoom in 1917, and these are in the 40s, and Lieber has started to write Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser in the 30s, but significantly writes it in the 50s and 60s. Given that this is really maybe the biggest early reference point for that idea of in adventure books, particularly this kind of science or fantasy adventure book of what we'd call the dungeon trap. And so there's certainly plenty of those in here. What are some other ones that come to mind? A secret door to lead to a passage between 2 cities. One thing, there's also, and this is somewhat elsewhere in the genre too, certainly, but the book Lost on Venus has essentially a dark wizard who animates the dead and gives them a semblance of sentience, and has a keep of them and a city full of them. There are gigantic 5,000 foot trees or something like that, whatever it is, mountain high trees with cities in them, particularly where the Pargians, who are the background kingdom for the heroine of the books, J.R.R. There's that. There's also the general stuff similar with John Carter or something, where Carson, Napier, though Napier and Carter are more heroic perhaps than many D&D heroes in the early days, more heroic than Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser or Conan, there is a degree of the sort of action-adventure hero with many skills, the sort of basically the fighter type, particularly in the case of both Carter and Napier, who tracks, I think, onto D&D quite well, and you can see his influence in adventure. Here's an adventurer who goes around, he fights monsters, he goes to a city of the dead, he has to work his way out through a dungeon, that sort of thing. It's pretty archetypal for D&D, along with those other key early influences. There's also just a lot of interesting spins on animals and monsters. We've got a decent picture of one here, a reptile-y thing with a gigantic tongue, and it's actually got has the wrong depiction, but a big gigantic single eye. It's a D&D beast. You can see it in a D&D bestiary. I cannot think of it actually being in a first edition bestiary. It will definitely be in some Cavaliers of Mars kind of bestiary, but nonetheless you can see this all as, and probably more richly than in Conan or Fafhrd, you maybe along with Lovecraft, on the other hand, you can see this is where weird natural or semi-natural beasts come from for Gygax, amongst others, but maybe more than anyone else is from Burroughs. And these books will have given him several very clear and good ideas, and can probably give us those good ideas too. Anyway, that is what I have for now. If I've missed anything that you can think of, tell me in the comments. I'd like to know. As I say, I struggled with this one in terms of the research side. But yeah, other than that, I will see you next time.